Hi, and welcome to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to talk about income distribution. So to kick things off, we're going to review a concept called gross domestic product, better known as GDP. Because if you'll remember, GDP shows us a nation's total spending in a given time. Recall that GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So it shows us how much money is being spent in a nation at a given time. But here's the thing. A dollar spent by one person is a dollar earned by another person, right? Because there's always a buyer and a seller. So, in the same way that GDP shows us a nation's total spending, GDP also shows us a nation's total earning. In other words, it shows us a nation's total income. For the very simple reason, again, that spending is equal to earning. Because a dollar spent by one person is a dollar earned by another, right? So keep that logic in your mind. GDP tells us a nation's income, how much money a country makes. And you've seen this before, but this is the United States GDP, this time real GDP, since World War II. And so let's think about what this means. This is our national income. This is how much money is being made by the United States. It started off in 1945 at just over $2 trillion, and today is over $19 trillion. That's our national income right there. It's a massive number. And as I've previously said in a different video, it's the biggest in the world, right? So in terms of GDP by country, only like a handful of countries like the United States, China, and Japan have a GDP over $4.87 trillion. The rest of the countries of the world have an income of much less than that. So when you hear people say that the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, that's because it is. And China is the second wealthiest country in the world, and Japan is third. Because again, GDP tells us a country's income. But, as it turns out, maybe just looking at GDP isn't a great way to measure how the average person is doing in a country or how real regular people are doing in a country. Because one thing that GDP doesn't tell us is about population. So look at that. When you look at this map, the United States and China, they're the top dogs, they're the leaders. But as you may or may not know, the populations of these countries are very different. Which one has a bigger population? Well, that'd be China. China has a much bigger population than the United States. So, to get better information about the wealth that an average person enjoys, you need to look at something called GDP per capita. Because the problem with regular GDP is it doesn't account for population, but GDP per capita does. And so per capita, if you've heard that before, just means per person. That's all it means. It's not that complicated. So to calculate GDP per capita, it's very, very simple. You take a country's GDP, dollar figure, and you divide it by a country's population. That's it. Pretty easy, right? Just how many dollars does the country make? How many people are in the country? And what that's going to tell you is the average income per person, right? That's all you're doing. So we can use a nominal GDP to calculate nominal GDP per capita, or we can use real GDP to calculate real GDP per capita. Obviously, real is better because it removes the effects of price changes. But when you look at a country's GDP per capita, that tells you a little bit more about how the average person lives in that country, but it's very misleading at the same time because there's a problem. When we do this, it assumes that every, man, woman, and baby child in the United States or in any given country has an equal income, which is of course preposterous, right? So we'll come back to that, but let's look at some GDPs per capita around the world. So this looks like the map that you saw in the previous slide here, but it's different. This is GDP per capita rather than just GDP. And so what we're looking at is GDP per capita in the thousands, right? So this, for instance, the dark blue is greater than $48,000 per capita, per person. So in the United States, what that means, for instance, because the color is dark blue, is the average American has an income of over $48,000 a year. Now, for some people, they're going to make more than that. For some people, they're going to make less than that. For some people, they're going to make exactly that, right? It's an average. But again, we know that countries like China and India have massive populations. So while China might enjoy a very high GDP, they actually have a relatively low GDP per capita because their population is so massive. So the US and Canada, Both have high GDPs per capita. Most of Western Europe and the Scandinavian countries all have that, as does Australia and Japan. So GDP per capita tells us a lot more than regular GDP about how the average person in a country is living. We can also do this within the United States as well, not just like country to country. This is GDP per capita in 2017 on a state-by-state basis. So the way to read this map, the darker the color, the higher the GDP per capita. So take a look. In the darkest blue color, that means that the average income per person in that state is over $70,000 a year. That's what that means. And that's only a handful of states like Alaska, North Dakota, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., and of course, the great state of Delaware. Other countries are unfortunately much poorer per person. Mississippi seems like they're in kind of last place here, in that the GDP per capita, the average income per person, is between $30,000 and $40,000 a year. Now, of course, the cost of living is much lower in some of these places and much higher in others. But what I want you to see here is that there are disparities even within a country. There are differences even within a country in GDP per capita. So, the main problem with GDP per capita, again, is that it tells you the average income per person, but ignores income inequality. The fact that some people make much, much more money and some people make much, much less money. Turns out there are other great statistics that we can use to address this issue, starting with something called the Gini Coefficient. The Gini Coefficient measures income inequality specifically. And we're not going to get into the math of how this is calculated. If you take AP Economics, that is something that we'll talk about. But for now, all you need to know is that a Gini coefficient can be between 0 and 1. That's the range. And so a Gini coefficient of 0 means that income is perfectly distributed in a country. In other words, real GDP per capita is what it is, right? Everybody gets an equal share of income. Every single man, woman, and baby child gets an equal share of the income. A Gini coefficient of 1 means that literally one single person in the country has all of the country's income and nobody else has any income. So these are the extremes, right? Either perfectly divided or one person hoards all income, everybody else gets nothing. So obviously then, the higher the number means the greater income inequality, meaning that wealth, income, is concentrated in a smaller group of people within a country. A lower number means that the income is more evenly spread out amongst the people. So in other words, lower number, small gap between rich and poor. Big number, huge gap between rich and poor. And this is how the countries of the world actually do. So when you see a color of orange, that means that it's a low Gini coefficient, specifically between 0 and 0.29. Income is very evenly distributed in these countries. So we've got some countries in Central Europe like Germany, the Czech Republic, the Scandinavian countries, places like that. And then as we go through the scale here, you can see the income gets a little bit more uneven in the purple, right? That'd be Australia, Canada, India, places like that. And the blue, which is what some of these big countries are, is about middle of the road. That's the US, Mexico, Russia, China, places like that. There's Iran. And then as you get to the green, it gets worse, right? Higher Gini coefficient in countries like Brazil. There's a lot more income inequality. The rich are rich, the poor are poor. And then in the black color, this is the absolute worst of the worst. That means that there is a huge concentration of wealth in the smallest number of people, and that most people in the country have much, much less income. So that would be countries in the southern part of Africa. That would be Hong Kong as well. So it's useful to see that information because, again, what we've started with is GDP, just the nation's income. And then we said, okay, well, we have to factor in population. So we used GDP per capita. And the Gini coefficient tells us even further, how is that income actually distributed in a country? So that's one thing I wanted you to see. The other thing I wanted you to see are a couple of pie charts. So first, this one. You've seen this one from a previous video. Remember that in terms of the world's income, humanity's income, the United States of America has a quarter of humanity's income. 24.3%, almost a quarter of the world's wealth is in the United States of America. China, about 15% of the world's wealth is in China. And then as we go through, you can see the shares get smaller and smaller. Japan, Germany, the UK, and then All of the other countries that are not seen here, which is again over 100 countries not seen here, have 20% of the world's income. So you can already tell from this pie chart that most of the world's wealth is concentrated in just a handful of countries. I mean, how many countries is this? Look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 20 countries listed here that have 80% of the world's wealth. The other, 160 odd countries, they all share 20% of the entire world's wealth. So that should tell you a lot about where the wealth is in the world. So if you live in one of these countries, it's not to say that you are necessarily rich. It just means that you're living in some of the wealthiest countries in the world. But remember though, these are just GDP numbers. This isn't GDP per capita. Let's look at a similar pie chart with populations. So what you're looking at in the pie chart on the left is the world's population distribution. 18% of humans, 18.5% of humans live in the country of China. About 18% of the world's humans live in India, right? These are massive populated countries. Only 4.3% of humans live in the United States of America, and the breakdown continues along here. And then, again, this is other countries. But one of the things I wanted to point out is, again, that the United States has about 24% of the world's income, but is only 4.3% of the world's humans. In other words, just to get a sense of how rich the United States actually is as a country, you've got a quarter of the world's income going to 4.3% of the world's people. Very wealthy. Countries like India, on the other hand, only control 2.8% of the world's income. There's India over here. And yet, almost 1 in every 5 humans is Indian. So that should give you an idea of just how, unequal the distribution of income around the world actually is, and how relatively rich and how relatively poor some people in the world actually are. And that perspective can be very difficult to ascertain if you live in one of these very wealthy countries. If you live in one of these poorer countries, you're all too aware of it. So this video has been about income distribution and what it's actually like in the world. Thanks for watching.